Scattered throughout most of Eastern and Western Europe are the remains of a once powerful empire. Crumbling and overgrown, yet hauntingly silent, these monumental structures that were built to last 1,000 years have now become the graveyard of a culture and ideology that ended with the death of the Third Reich. Germania, the Fuehrers' dream city and capital of the New World Order. In 1937, Hitler commissioned architect Albert Speer to draw plans for the transformation of Berlin into a forceful expression of German greatness and superiority. Rising more than 1,000 feet above the ground, the Great Hall could hold a gathering of up to 180,000 people. It would be the largest building in the world. The new metropolis of Germania not only served as the blueprint for Germany's architectural revolution, but revealed the future of the 1,000-year Reich. The road to Germania began as early as 1933, when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and an entire nation was set back to work. Groundbreaking ceremonies not only signaled the awakening of Germany's economy, but instilled in its people a new sense of national pride. The new Autobahn roadway system was viewed by the German people as a remarkable example of modern technology, willpower, and achievement in the spirit of National Socialism. Other projects included the enormous structures at the Nazi party grounds in Nuremberg. The grandstands at the Zeppelinfeld could accommodate nearly 300,000 spectators. While Hermann Goring's Air Ministry building in Berlin expressed Germany's growing military power, Hitler's new Reichschancellery emphasized the growing wealth of the regime. In Munich, the architectural revolution included the Leaders' Building, known as the Führerbau, and the impressive Haus der Deutschen Kunst, the House of German Art. It was Professor Paul Ludwig Troost's neoclassic designs of both the House of Art and Führerbau that set the standard for what eventually became known as Nazi architecture. Hitler, who fancied himself an artist, insisted on having the final word on all building plans commissioned by his architects, usually rejecting the first drafts and then making continual changes along the way. As early as the 1920s, Hitler was already sketching the buildings of a future empire, dream buildings that would soon become reality. Suggesting a frustrated architect with an abundance of confidence but lacking in artistic ability, his drawings included a new dome for the Reichstag, a great hall resembling the centerpiece of Germania, and even a triumphal arch patterned after Paris's Arc de Triomphe. He also laid out plans for what eventually would become his mountain retreat on the Obersalzberg. Hitler's vision of a new utopia began taking shape when he arrived in Vienna at the turn of the century to enroll in the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts. Rejected twice for failing to meet the school's high technical standards, the 18-year-old visionary from Linz was finally forced to face the prospects of reality. But the thought of holding any kind of regular job offends his artistic ambitions, and he begins wandering the streets selling an occasional painting just to make enough for a sporadic meal. His works were considered vague and unimaginative, consisting mainly of lifeless and desolated buildings. With Hitler's arrival in Munich in 1913, he began capturing his first impressions of the city's most famous landmarks, including the royal residence with its multiple courtyards. There was also the historic Feldherrnhalle, which would play the most important role in both the military and political life of Adolf Hitler. Patterned after the Loggia de Lanzi in Florence, the Feldherrnhalle was built by King Ludwig I of Bavaria and completed in 1844. The monument honors military generals like Count Tilly, the heroic commander of the 30 Years' War, as well as the thousands of soldiers that served in the 19th century Bavarian army. The historic landmark, which was almost totally destroyed by Allied bombs during the Second World War, was completely restored to its original condition by the late 1960s. It was here that on August 1, 1914, in the midst of a cheering crowd, that the Austrian-born rebel would first realize his role in German history. "I fell on my knees," he would later write, "and thanked heaven for having lived at such a time." He joins the 16th Bavarian Regiment as a dispatch runner and is wounded and later gassed. He's decorated twice for bravery and wins the Iron Cross First Class and is promoted to the rank of corporal. It's while in the ranks of the Bavarian army that Adolf Hitler first learns the meaning of the word Kameradschaft, the spirit of brotherhood. Following the war, Hitler returns to the land of beer and pretzels, where he finds the streets and beer gardens of Munich filled with disillusioned soldiers and unemployed workers. But at the Stirnecker Bräukeller, the defeat of Germany and the mythical betrayal of Versailles would only bring opportunity to an embittered Adolf Hitler. In the fall of 1919, Hitler attends several meetings of a small political group called the German Workers' Party. He emerges from the smoke-filled Stirnecker Bräukeller as its propaganda chief and undisputed leader. But it was here in the festival hall of Munich's world-famous Hofbräuhaus on February 24, 1920, that Hitler would outline his agenda for a racially pure society. The 25-point program not only defined the organization's goals, but signaled the birth of the Nazi Party. The Hofbräuhaus was founded in 1589 by Duke Wilhelm V of Bavaria and has survived more than 400 years of German turmoil. The present building, which suffered severe damage during World War II, was first completed in 1897 and is still regarded today as one of Munich's most popular tourist attractions. It was here at the Hofbräuhaus that Hitler developed many of his oratory skills when he was forced to scream over noisy hecklers and flying beer mugs. It was also here on April 1, 1920, that the party name was officially changed to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. On February 24, 1941, the Fuhrer of the German Reich returned to the Hofbräuhaus to celebrate the 21st anniversary of the NSDAP's founding doctrine. Surrounded by members of his old guard known as the Alte Kämpfer, Hitler reaffirmed the 25-point program, which called for a racially pure society, measures of extreme nationalism, nullification of the Treaty of Versailles, and a policy of brutal anti-Semitism. The occasion was broadcast live throughout the Greater German Reich, as well as the Axis countries of Italy and Japan. Hitler used the one-hour speech to highlight some of his greatest accomplishments, including a great economy, low unemployment, rebuilding the military, and the reoccupation of German territory. But it was the Berker Bräukeller that would go down in history for its role in the Nazi Party's rise to power. With its huge seating capacity of more than 2,000 people, the infamous beer hall was chosen by Hitler as the place where he would make his first major appearance following his release from Landsberg prison. His fiery speech of February 27, 1925, was designed to re-establish him as the undisputed leader of the party. During the Third Reich, the Berker Bräukeller was regarded as a revered Nazi site after it became the assembly point for Hitler's ill-fated beer hall Putsch of 1923. Hitler, along with members of his old guard, would gather every year on the anniversary of the Putsch to retrace their steps of that fateful morning of November 9th. As the story goes, Hitler, along with 3,000 supporters, including Hermann Goring, Julius Streicher, and General Erich Ludendorff, began a march through the heart of the city toward the War Ministry building to seize control and rescue party loyalists Heinrich Himmler and Ernst Röhm. But as the marchers approached the barricades at the Feldherrnhalle, the police opened fire. 16 Nazis are shot dead. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he ordered that the site be designated as an honor memorial known as an Ehrenmall. The monument, which featured a 24-hour SS honor guard, was designed by Hitler's favorite architect, Professor Paul Ludwig Trost. The guard post was stationed directly below an impressive 10-foot bronze plaque containing the names of the 16 fallen Nazis killed during the Putsch. The intimidating SS honor guard helped to ensure that the civilian population passing the shrine would respond with the Nazi salute. However, those choosing to avoid the site could easily cut through an alleyway directly behind the Feldherrnhalle, which quickly became known as Shirker's Alley. By late 1943, the war had reduced the annual November 9th commemoration to nothing more than a formality. The elaborate pageant celebrating heroic death once lasted for an entire day and included thousands of marchers parading down a 2-mile stretch of street-lined funeral urns, while hidden loudspeakers dramatically recalled the names of the dead. With General Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel acting as Hitler's surrogate, the later version of the event was concluded in less than 20 minutes. Today, there's no trace of the once sacred Ehrenmall. Other rituals at the Feldherrnhalle included the Midnight Pledge of Loyalty and Obedience on the eve of the Putsch by the newly commissioned officers of the SS. There were countless numbers of funerals glorifying death conducted before the revered monument, including the memorial service for the 7 victims killed during the attempt on Hitler's life at the Berghof. On the evening of November 8, 1939, a couple of months after the invasion of Poland, Hitler came to Munich to speak at the annual Putsch reunion at the Berghof. Shortly before he was scheduled to speak, a cabinet maker by the name of George Elser placed a bomb in a junction box, which was close to the speaker's podium. But within an hour after Hitler began speaking, he felt uneasy and insisted on leaving the beer hall immediately. 8 minutes after Hitler's departure, the bomb exploded with such tremendous force, it ripped the entire roof from its foundations, devastating the entire structure. 7 people were killed and another 63 wounded, including the father of Hitler's mistress, Eva Braun. The Berghof was eventually rebuilt and used as an American service club until it was demolished in 1958. Strangely, Elser, who confessed to the crime, wasn't even tried, let alone executed, fueling speculation that the attempt was staged on Hitler's orders. There are those who believe that Hitler would have sacrificed the entire overflowing crowd of more than 2,000 people on that night of November 8th, just to prove that a divine providence was guiding his every move, including the invasion of Poland. Within a few days after the 1923 Putsch, Hitler, along with Ludendorff and the other rebel leaders, was arrested for treason and put on trial. He serves less than 9 months of a 5-year sentence at Landsberg prison, where he begins writing the first several chapters of the Nazi Bible. Entitled 4.5 Years of Lies, Cowardice, and Stupidity, the awkward name, which proved much too clumsy for marketing purposes, was simply changed to Mein Kampf. On December 20th, 1924, the day of his release, Hitler poses for a series of publicity shots in front of the gates to the Old City. Often mistaken as the entrance to the prison, the shots at the 16th century Viator Gate proved so successful that Hitler returned 10 years later just to recapture the moment for the national press. In 1925, the Nazis began rebuilding the party, which grew from a meager 27,000 members to more than 180,000 by the elections of 1930. Using tactics like intimidation through violence and a campaign promise of restoring national pride in the German economy, the National Socialists succeeded in winning 107 seats in the German Reichstag. From the very first day of their arrival in Parliament, the Nazis bring an unrelentless policy of disruption and chaos with the intention of ending German democracy. In the presidential elections of 1932, von Hindenburg wins re-election by capturing a surprising 53% of the vote, prompting speculation that Hitler's quest for power is over. But during the following year, the Weimar Republic collapses, forcing opposition leaders to strike a compromise, leaving Hindenburg with no alternative but to appoint Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. January 30th, 1933 would not only introduce a new leader to the German people, but bring a great nation to the brink of disaster with the birth of the Third Reich. Even as Hitler begins assembling his new cabinet, Nazi stormtroopers are striking out against his enemies with the arrest of more than 500 people and the murder of 91 others. Less than a month later, the disciples of revenge would strike again with the burning of the Reichstag on February 27, 1933. A little more than 2 months after the Reichstag fire, the flames of tyranny would rise again with the burning of the books on May 10th. This time, the works of free-thinking intellectuals like Thomas Mann, H.G. Wells, Albert Einstein, and Sigmund Freud would go up in smoke. Fueled by the inflammatory speech of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, the burning of the books signaled the end of free thought in Germany and the start of the country's Nazi indoctrination. The Opernplatz in Berlin, where the event took place, has been renamed the Bebelplatz and remains virtually unchanged today. The only exception is a marker in an underground library, which contains copies of many of the destroyed works. By the middle of 1934, one of the last remaining obstacles in Hitler's quest for complete and total power was the 4 million members of the SA. Under the leadership of Ernst Röhm, this violent gang of ex-soldiers, street fighters, and misfits known as the Sturmabteilung had managed to further the revolution by seizing control of the streets and crushing Hitler's political opponents. Ernst Röhm was born in Munich on November 28, 1887, and was not only one of the founding fathers of National Socialism, but one of the leading participants in the infamous beer hall putsch of 1923. A ruthless soldier and notorious homosexual, Röhm created a powerful paramilitary force that now threatened the Army High Command, the future of the Nazi Party, and the political survival of Adolf Hitler. It was time for Röhm and the SA leadership to go. On the afternoon of June 29, 1934, Röhm and other high-ranking members of the SA headed for a weekend conference at the Hotel Hanslbauer at Bad Wiessee. It was the hotel's secluded location and tranquil lakeside setting that made the Hanslbauer a longtime favorite of the SA, their wild parties, and a variety of illicit activities. Located about 50 miles southeast of Munich, the Bavarian resort in the SA would become synonymous with the bloody purge known as the Night of the Long Knives. In the early morning hours of June 30th, 1934, while the SA leadership partied and drank in the hotel dining room, Hitler and his SS entourage were racing toward Bad Wiessee to settle accounts. Unaware of their impending peril, for many, this celebration would turn out to be their last. By the time Hitler and his SS bodyguard reached Bad Wiessee, the festivities had already broken up and began spreading to various rooms throughout the hotel. Within minutes after the SS secured the building, Hitler quickly locates room 335, awakens a groggy Röhm, and accuses him of treason and moral delinquency. He's arrested and taken to Stadelheim prison in Munich, where he's executed just 2 days later. Meanwhile, Sepp Dietrich, the leader of Hitler's SS bodyguard, bursts into the room of SA Gruppenführer Edmund Heinz and his male lover, and shoots them both point blank. In all, the bloody purge of 1934 ended with the deaths of more than 500 people, and with hundreds more arrested and imprisoned. With the success of the purge, the Army General Staff was now ready to throw their total support behind Hitler, paving the way for his supreme leadership. Just 1 month later, Hitler's quest for absolute power would come with the death of President Paul von Hindenburg on August 2, 1934. The grand old field marshal and hero of Tannenberg would unwittingly leave a marred legacy as the man who brought about the fall of Germany and the rise of the Third Reich with his appointment of Hitler as Chancellor. The eldest son of an aristocratic Prussian officer, Paul Hans Anton von Beneckendorf und von Hindenburg, was born in Posen on October 2, 1847. At the early age of 16, he enters Berlin's prestigious Hauptkadetenstadt Military Academy, and less than 3 years later is promoted to the rank of second lieutenant. He distinguishes himself in both the 7 Weeks and Franco-Prussian Wars, and in 1904 is promoted to lieutenant general and commanding officer of the 4th Army Corps in Magdeburg. It was here several years later, during field maneuvers with the Kaiser's imperial troops, that Major General von Hindenburg inadvertently won the battle, prompting his early retirement at the age of 64. But with the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Hindenburg is called back into service and promoted to the rank of Colonel General. He's given command of the 8th Army on the Eastern Front, and together with his quartermaster general, the brilliant strategist Erich von Ludendorff, they defeat the overwhelming Russian forces of General Samsonov in the Battle of Tannenberg. The stunning victory catapults the two men into national heroes. Today, the former 1914 battlefield is littered with the graves and markers of more than 30,000 Russian soldiers killed on August 27th, 28th, and 29th. In addition to the dead, more than 100,000 Russians were taken prisoner. In 1916, Hindenburg was promoted to the rank of General Field Marshal and Chief of the General Staff, with von Ludendorff as his first Quartermaster General. But unlike Tannenberg, the Western Front would only bring defeat. Tens of thousands of Germans were either killed or wounded, and thousands more were captured and imprisoned. The humiliating defeat would ultimately lead to von Hindenburg's second retirement in 1919. At the age of 72, the hero of Tannenberg returns home to his wife Gertrude, where he plans to enjoy a well-deserved retirement while writing his memoirs at the family mansion in Hanover. But with the death of President Ebert in 1925, the patriotic Hindenburg is called on one more time to serve his country. He becomes Germany's very first democratically elected president. In 1932, a reluctant von Hindenburg is persuaded to run for a second term against the ambitious and much younger Adolf Hitler. Following a vigorously fought campaign, the conservative Hindenburg wins re-election by a margin of more than 6 million votes over his Nazi opponent. At the age of 84, a tired and weary Paul von Hindenburg begins serving his second term as President of Germany. But as the pressures of corruption begin to disintegrate the Weimar Republic, opposing factions leave Hindenburg with no other choice but to appoint Hitler as Chancellor in January 1933. The move would ultimately reduce the aging president to nothing more than a figurehead. He turns further away from politics and begins spending more time devoted to the military career of his son Oscar at their West Prussian estate known as Neudeck. Renovated at a cost of more than 1 million marks, the Neudeck estate was presented to the president on his 80th birthday as a gift from the German people. Originally, the property was donated to the family by Frederick the Great in the 18th century for meritorious service, and eventually became Hindenburg's childhood home. However, following World War I, the property was confiscated when it was learned that a distant relative had been court-martialed for treason several decades earlier. But with the help of his son Oscar and a questionable subscription scheme, the property was reacquired, and Hindenburg was finally able to return to his beloved Neudeck. When the Red Army took control of the area in January 1945, they found the house abandoned, and for the next couple of months it became the division headquarters for Zhukov's Second Soviet Army. What remains of the mansion today is located at the top of this hill and consists of little more than a few scattered ruins. Shortly after the departure of the Red Army, the house mysteriously caught fire, and during the next several years, local vandals plundered the property, leaving the foundations to crumble and dissolve. The only surviving buildings of the Hindenburg estate today lie just beyond the old gates directly behind the house. When Neudeck was expanded in 1927, the farm was presented to the family as a gift and came complete with horses and other livestock. While the stables and several other buildings like the feed shed remain in excellent condition, others appear frozen in time with the death of the president on August 2, 1934. At the Tannenberg National Memorial a few days later, there was an outpouring of grief by tens of thousands of mourners who gathered to pay their final respects to the grand old field marshal. The funeral of Reichspräsident Paul von Hindenburg on August 6, 1934, could only be described as a grand display of military pageantry and regal splendor. While each of the imposing towers was draped with streams of black banners, the court of honor in the center of the monument was decorated with a collection of regimental German flags from the First World War. Hindenburg's body was laid to rest in what eventually became known as the Presidential Tower, where he remained for almost a year. As the silent procession of mourners filed past the coffin, they were each compelled to give the Nazi salute, a greeting that Hindenburg despised and refused to ever recognize. But considering the fact that Hitler purposely orchestrated the funeral not only to pay tribute to a national hero, but also to reaffirm his own succession to power, the salute was made a necessity. In October 1935, the monument underwent modification, which included the removal of a huge stage in the center of the court and the construction of a special crypt for Hindenburg and his wife Gertrude. Each one of the 650-foot towers were given names like Eingangtor, Feldherrn, Deutsche Frontsoldaten, Fahnen, Weihe, Ostpreußen, Präsidenten, and Hindenburg. Other changes included the addition of an honor court known as an Ehrenhof, and the monument's name was officially changed from the Tannenberg National Denkmal to Reichsehrenmal. In the fall of 1944, funerals were still being conducted at Tannenberg even as the Red Army was rapidly approaching the memorial. One of the last, officiated by Hermann Goring, was for General Gunther Korten, whose distinguished career included commander of the Luftwaffe in Austria and commander-in-chief of the Air Force General Staff. The 46-year-old Korten died of injuries suffered during an assassination attempt on Hitler's life at the Fuehrers' headquarters in East Prussia. On the afternoon of July 20th, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a briefcase concealing a bomb underneath a conference table. While Hitler was only slightly injured, 3 others were killed instantly. Korten, who was seated directly behind von Stauffenberg, died 2 days later at a Rostenburg hospital from blood poisoning. The new Hindenburg crypt was completed in the fall of 1935 and was located directly below the South Tower. Designed by Walter and Johannes Kruger, the impressive entrance was dominated by 2 14-foot sculptures of the Eternal Watch known as the Ewige Wache, and was carved out of more than 120 tons of imported Königsberg granite. The solemn mausoleum with its dramatic vaulted ceilings featured 2 Wehrmacht honor guards posted just outside the marble-plated vault. On October 2, 1935, the anniversary of his birthday, the president's bronze coffin was relocated to the sombering chamber, where he was joined by his wife Gertrude, who was moved from the family plot in Hanover. The Hindenburgs remained at the monument until January 1945, before reaching their final resting place at the Church of St. Elizabeth in Marburg. As Soviet forces were within a few miles of Tannenberg, the coffins were moved to a bunker just outside Berlin, About a month later, the Hindenburgs, along with the remains of King Wilhelm I and Frederick the Great, were moved to a salt mine for safekeeping. But it wasn't until the following year that the Hindenburgs were finally relegated to the church of their Teutonic ancestors by the American Army in the spring of 1946. The Tannenberg National Memorial was dedicated by Hindenburg on the 10th anniversary of the battle and opened 3 years later in September 1927. Today, a protruding island in an isolated field in northern Poland is all that remains of the 120-acre monument following its destruction by the Polish government in the spring of 1948. The only recognizable feature of the Tannenberg National Memorial is the Eingangsstrasse, or main road, which led directly to the entrance of the structure. The Ehrenhof, or Court of Honor, which measured about the size of a football field, has been reduced to little more than an overgrown pit of scattered debris and rubble. In stark irony, the stone and granite that once served as a memorial to Germany's fallen war heroes now commemorate the honor of its enemies and victims throughout Poland, which includes the Soviet War Memorial in Ostend and the Heroes of the Ghetto Monument in Warsaw. The only surviving relic from the Tannenberg National Monument today is a sculptured lion in the nearby town of Ostenik. Once perched on the top of a 20-foot commemorative pillar at the entrance to the memorial, the noble stone lion was dedicated to the unsung heroes of the 23rd Missourian Infantry Division, killed during the Battle of Tannenberg in late August 1914. March 7, 1936, Germany reoccupies the Rhineland, and never again would Europe have the chance to stop Hitler without the threat of war. Meanwhile, a new spirit of national pride and honor begins sweeping throughout the country, as the humiliation of Versailles and high unemployment were quickly forgotten. While a life of good times and prosperity had once again returned to the German people, the roots of National Socialism had become intertwined in both the nation's culture and its society. It was a time when the image of the regime and great opportunity had created a reawakening of industry and technology, resulting in the tremendous popularity of Adolf Hitler, who now sought refuge in his little southeastern corner of Bavaria called Berchtesgaden. Another 3,000 feet above the village, in a scenic little health resort called the Obersalzberg, visitors would arrive at an SS gate located just below the Fuehrers' mountaintop chalet. Often described as a clumsy, blown-up version of an alpine cottage, the Berghof grew from a modest country cabin into an extravagant residence reflecting a world leader. It was here, along with his mistress Eva Braun, that Hitler surrounded himself with his most trusted friends, German pastries, and the sounds of Wagner's heroic operas. The Berghof's relaxed and intimate setting also proved ideal for the official receptions of foreign dignitaries. The centerpiece of the house was the Great Hall, where Hitler would meet with the heads of state, examine military charts with his generals, and entertain members of his inner circle until 3 o'clock in the morning. It was here on February 12, 1938, that Hitler served Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg with an ultimatum called the Berchtesgaden Dictate, which led to the annexation of Austria just 1 month later. The breathtaking hall was complemented by a red marble fireplace at one end and a massive picture window at the other, which raised or lowered for seasonal use. But it was the much smaller Bavarian-style living room with its brightly covered pillows and curtains that actually proved more popular with family and friends. The Arbeitszimmer des Führers, which served as Hitler's private office, was lined with spruce-paneled walls and floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a spectacular view of the Untersberg mountain. The spruce paneling was also duplicated in Hitler's second-floor study, where he'd begin each morning by reviewing his daily schedule, which began at around 11. The pale larchwood paneled walls in the Speissaal, or dining room, generated a warm rustic elegance, which created an ideal atmosphere for the gathering of family and friends, as well as members of Hitler's staff. The Berghof was truly a place for all seasons, where military staff as well as foreign diplomats converged on the mountain retreat seeking counsel and reassurance from Adolf Hitler. In February 1941, Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop hosted a series of talks between Japanese Ambassador Hiroshi Oshima and the leader of the German Reich. It was General Oshima who eventually persuaded Hitler to join the Japanese in a war against the United States, a promise Hitler reluctantly kept following the December 7th attack on Pearl Harbor. In the fall of 1941, Field Marshal Peter von Bock, commander of Army Group Central in Russia, was summoned to the Berghof to give a status report on Operation Barbarossa. His heated arguments with Hitler over battle strategy on the Eastern Front finally led to his dismissal a few months later. Reichsmarshal Hermann Goring, one of only 3 Nazi bigwigs living within the secured area known as the Führergebiet, was a frequent visitor to the house, but strictly on a professional rather than a social basis. With the arrival of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain on September 15, 1938, there came a string of concessions that led to the occupation and breakup of Czechoslovakia 6 months later. It was the radical priest and devoted Nazi Joseph Tiso who became leader of the German protectorate called Slovakia. Tiso, a man who could devour an entire pound of ham in one meal, proved a more than willing Nazi accomplice, and after the war was tried and executed by the restored nation of Czechoslovakia. There was a time when streams of admirers were permitted to pay homage to their Führer on a daily basis, a practice his security service found very risky. When Hitler first arrived on the Obersalzberg in the spring of 1923, the area was still an unspoiled little health resort that the Nazi leader quickly fell in love with, and where he chose to set up permanent residency 2 years later. It was here in the sanctuary of this mountaintop retreat that Hitler completes Mein Kampf, cultivates important benefactors, and begins renting the rustic little cottage known as Haus Wachenfeld. The Folkish-styled chalet with its dramatic overhanging roof consisted of 3 modest bedrooms on the upper floor and a living room, dining room, and sun parlor on the lower. The chalet was originally built for a successful businessman from Hamburg, who in turn rented it to Hitler in 1928. It wasn't until 5 months after he became Chancellor in 1933 that Hitler was finally able to purchase the house and begin a series of 3 renovations. Window shutters and a small office were added first, followed by the stone terrace and a winter garden a year later. But it was the third and final stage of renovation that ultimately transformed Haus Wachenfeld into the sprawling landhouse known as the Berghof. Hitler's unique design allowed for the old house to be preserved into the new, while at the same time retaining its quaint Bavarian facade. The impressive stone terrace designed by Alois Degano not only formed the roof of the garage, but also served as the focal point of all social activities for members of Hitler's inner circle, his staff, and a variety of special guests. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop was primarily on hand for the reception of world leaders and dignitaries. While Joseph Goebbels rarely visited the house, architect Albert Speer was there on a daily basis. There were members of Hitler's old guard like Munich Gauleiter Adolf Wagner, and the ominous leadership of the SS, including Himmler, Heydrich, and Wolf. Following a late lunch, Hitler would make the daily pilgrimage to the small tea house on the Mooslahnerkopf. A railed pathway directly opposite the Berghof led visitors on a half-hour journey through a wonderland of nature and wildlife, which remains virtually unchanged today. About 20 minutes later, the entourage would arrive at the entrance of a thick-wooded area on the opposite side of the meadow. It was this tranquil pine-littered trail that would eventually bring Hitler to his favorite place on the mountaintop, the Mooslahnerkopf lookout. With its panoramic view of the Untersberg mountain, the fabled resting place of Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa, Hitler would spend hours gazing at the valley below, contemplating some of his most important decisions. After about a half hour of light conversation, throwing together some ideas for a major speech, or just lost in several moments of deep thought, the Führer and his entourage would begin the short 50-foot walk to the little tea house. Perched on a ledge overlooking the valley, the uniquely shaped building with its circular-style tea room was without question the main attraction on the Mooslahnerkopf. With its enticing aromas of fresh ground coffee and German pastries, Hitler and his guests entered a magnificent little room decorated with panels of red marble framed in 24-karat gold leaf and accented by several cozy overstuffed chairs of red and beige velvet. What remains of the building today housed a secondary dining room, kitchen, and guardroom. And while a portion of the small tea room's inner wall, fireplace, and circular roof are still clearly recognizable, the remainder of the structure has been reduced to nothing more than a shell of brick and plaster brought about by local vandals, souvenir hunters, and the forces of nature. Designed by Professor Roderick Fick and completed in 1937, the ruins of Hitler's tea house remain as some of the most significant relics from the Nazi era on the Obersalzberg today. For those choosing not to make the 2-mile walk to the tea house, coffee, tea, and pastries were also served on the terrace of the Berghof. These trivial afternoon socials were often hosted by Hitler's longtime mistress, Eva Braun, a simple photographer's assistant from Munich. Forbidden to appear publicly with Hitler, she was relegated to the confines of the Berghof, watching her favorite movies, reading cheap romance novels, and entertaining members of the inner circle. On the morning of April 25, 1945, the British Royal Air Force dropped almost 1,200 tons of bombs on Hitler's Sacred Mountain, inflicting heavy damage on the Berghof, as well as most of the other buildings in the immediate area. While the Obersalzberg's elaborate underground bunker system kept the loss of life to just 6, Hitler's beloved Alpine Chalet was reduced into a shell of scorched walls and shattered rubble. The charred facade remained suspended in time until the U.S. occupational forces and the Free State of Bavaria ordered its demolition on April 30, 1952. But defying both the elements of man and nature, the ruins of the terrace managed to survive as a haunting witness to one of history's darkest moments. For more than 45 years, the massive structure which housed the garage provided a haven for souvenir hunters and curiosity seekers. Fearing that the ruins could possibly evolve into a sacred shrine for neo-Nazi activity, the garage, as well as several large pieces of debris, were finally bulldozed away in the summer of 1997. Today, a portion of the exposed driveway is the only evidence that Hitler's Berghof ever existed. Situated on the adjacent hill is the Gasthof zum Türken, the oldest surviving building on the Obersalzberg today. Built at around the turn of the century, the popular hotel was confiscated by the Nazis in 1933 and converted into RSD headquarters, the Reichssicherheitsdienst, or State Security Service. Directly opposite the Türken, on a hill overlooking the Berghof, was the oversized landhouse of Martin Bormann, Hitler's deputy and true master of the Obersalzberg. A crude and brutal man who wielded tremendous power, Bormann was both feared and despised by the other members of the inner circle. It was as Nazi Party secretary that Bormann was able to raise the enormous funds that transformed the quiet little mountain resort into a massive military compound. The 4 colossal buildings of Hitler's bodyguard detachment, the Leibstandarte SS, consisted of the barracks, mess hall, garage, and gymnasium. With its walls measuring nearly 2 feet thick, the complex also housed a movie theater, staff offices, canteen, and underground shooting range, and upon its completion in the spring of 1938, was designated SS Kaserne Obersalzberg. Martin Bormann was a ruthless taskmaster that subjected his vast army of thousands of workers to long hours and harsh conditions, while at the same time isolating the men from their family and friends. But Bormann, aware that the success of his monumental building scheme depended largely on the mental well-being of his labor force, had a spacious 2,000-seat theater hall built on a hill overlooking the construction site. Several times a week, a variety of popular films were shown until the roof of the structure collapsed in the winter of 1943. One of Bormann's pet projects was the elaborate farming estate known as the Gutsof. Completed in the summer of 1938, the surprisingly modern farm with its imposing administration building managed to survive the war and was converted into a vacation resort for American service personnel in May 1945. Renamed the Skytop Lodge, the property today is open to the general public and serves as the golf course, pro shop, and restaurant in the summer and a popular ski resort in the winter. During the glory days of the Third Reich, the Gutsof maintained 80 milk-producing cows, 100 head of hogs, and Bormann's prized collection of Haflinger mountain horses. But to Bormann's great embarrassment, neither the livestock or the 200 acres of farmland ever produced a profit. As the Gutsof was nearing completion, Bormann then turned his attention to the legendary Platterhof Hotel. A longtime Bavarian favorite since its founding as the Pension Moritz in 1877, the hotel became a famous landmark after it was immortalized in Richard Foss's best-selling novel, Zwei Menschen. It was here at the Platterhof in March 1923 that Adolf Hitler was first introduced to the tranquility of the mountain while visiting his longtime friend Dietrich Eckart. Years later, as thousands journeyed to the Obersalzberg to pay homage to their Fuhrer, Hitler ordered that a larger, more modern building be constructed in the likeness of the old Platterhof in order to accommodate the multitudes of visiting admirers. In the summer of 1938, the old building was torn down and replaced by the new luxurious neoclassic structure with its hand-carved wood ceilings, red marble pillars, mirrored halls, and 150 lavishly furnished rooms. But Bormann's idea of a people's hotel was drastically different from what Hitler had in mind, resulting in pricey rooms which were far too expensive for the average German, but perfectly suitable for the top brass of the Nazi Party. Severely damaged in the air raid of 1945, the building was completely restored and renamed the General Walker Hotel. From 1953 until their departure in 1995, the American military used the building as a retreat for vacationing service personnel. The historic building remained vacant for almost 5 years, until the Bavarian government ordered its total destruction in the winter of 1999. The smaller building at the far end of the hotel complex became one of the first structures renovated by the Nazis on the Obersalzberg. Originally, the building was used as a boarding house and guest lodge for the Pension Moritz, which later became the Platterhof. In 1935, the lodge, also known as a Gästehaus, became the official Nazi Party chancellery of the Obersalzberg. After the war, the rooms that once housed Bormann's private offices, as well as accommodations for his special guests and business associates, was left decaying for almost 5 decades. The lodge's most important overnight guest was the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. In 1999, Bormann's Parteikanzlei was reconstructed into a museum called Dokumentation Obersalzberg, which depicts the history of the mountain from the late 1800s to the present time. Exhibitions include Hitler and the Third Reich, Nazi terrorism, and the mountain as an alpine health resort. The museum also features a portion of the elaborate underground bunker system with its military command center. Perched on a jagged ledge more than 2,500 feet above the Obersalzberg is perhaps the crowning achievement of Bormann's building madness of the late 1930s. A drive today along the rugged 4-mile stretch of mountain road with its maze of hairpin turns and hand-chiseled tunnels is like a drive back in time. "20 minutes after leaving the Berghof, Bormann and his guests would arrive at the huge parking area 400 feet directly below their final destination. Built with a labor force of 3,000 men working under the harshest conditions, the granite edifice with its breathtaking panoramic views was completed in less than 1 year at a cost of 30 million Reichsmarks, an amount equal to more than $100 million today. On September 9, 1939, the stage was finally set for the lavish parties, gala celebrations, and extravagant weekend retreats that made Kehlsteinhaus the social playground for the family and friends of Hitler's inner circle. Aptly dubbed the Eagle's Nest, Kehlsteinhaus represents the only unrestored and unaltered structure built by the Nazis on the Obersalzberg today. The attractive stone entrance with its hand-carved arched frame is complemented by the original set of bronze and copper double security doors. After a brief walk along the marble tunnel stretching 400 feet under the mountain, visitors arrive at the highly polished brass elevator that rises to the 6,000-foot summit and one of Bavaria's most popular tourist attractions. Open from May through September, the Eagle's Nest affords thousands of visitors from around the world with the unique opportunity to experience the private life and opulent world of Adolf Hitler. The restaurant dining room, known as the Speisesaal, is paneled in a warm elm finish and accented with the charm of Old World Germany. Remarkably, during the glory days of Hitler in the Reich, the Speisesaal was only used twice. With the exception of the Alpine-style tables and chairs, the room is completely unchanged. The centerpiece of the Speisesaal was and still is the elegant china cabinet, which at one time was complemented by an enormous table with the capacity to seat more than 30 people. But shortly after the war, souvenir hunters began removing everything that wasn't fastened down, and as a result, the china cabinet remains the only original piece of furniture at the Eagle's Nest today. A few steps away from the dining room was the conference hall known as the Gesellschaftshalle, the largest room at Kehlstein. Dominated by the impressive marble and bronze-tiled fireplace presented to Hitler by Benito Mussolini in 1938, the room was the scene of important diplomatic meetings, social gatherings, and lavish parties. But undoubtedly, the most extravagant of these get-togethers was the wedding reception of Eva Braun's sister Gretel on June 3, 1944. While the average German was living on food rations, the wedding party was consuming enormous amounts of champagne, liqueurs, and meals fit for royalty. But the dramatic turn of events over the next several months would bring the extravagant lifestyle of Adolf Hitler and his inner circle to an abrupt end. Less than 1 year later, the stately furnished room with its massive round oak table and plush high-back armchairs would become a retreat for the 101st Airborne Division, the first Americans to land during the Allied invasion of Europe. The occupation of the Obersalzberg by the American military would last 50 years. With the exception of the furniture, the octagon-shaped conference hall remains virtually intact. The only part of the room that suffered any damage was the Mussolini fireplace, when it was victimized by souvenir hunters in the early 1950s. A few feet away was the favorite room of Eva Braun. With its handsomely paneled knotty pine walls and spectacular view, the intimate little tea room was simply furnished with an oversized dining table and wall couch. It was here that Martin Bormann, seated at the head of the table, hosted the reception dinner for Gretel Braun and SS Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein. But the marriage would come to an end less than a year later when Fegelein was executed for treason in the Chancellery Garden just before the end of the war. The small dining room at the rear of the building, used primarily for private parties, served as the guards' quarters for the SS sentry, posted at the Eagle's Nest year-round. In April 1939, Kehlsteinhaus was presented to the Fuhrer on his 50th birthday as a gift from the German people. But the fact that Hitler only made 13 visits to the mountain retreat not only fueled speculation he preferred the much smaller teehaus on the Mooslahnerkopf, but that Martin Bormann had failed in his attempt to further ingratiate himself with his master. But Bormann, never one to let a great opportunity pass him by, became Kehlstein's most frequent guest, second only to Eva Braun, her family, and friends. Of the many structures designed by Professor Roderick Fick, including the Platterhof, SS Kaserne, Theater Hall, and small teehaus on the Mooslahnerkopf, only the Gutsof and Eagle's Nest are still standing today. Back on the Obersalzberg, about 3,000 feet below the Eagle's Nest, was the spacious landhouse of Reichsmarshal Hermann Goring, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. The opulent chalet was complemented by a blue ceramic tiled swimming pool, considered extremely rare for this part of the world. Goring's precious Alpine Chalet, like many of the other buildings on the Obersalzberg, was destroyed in the British air raid of 1945. Future plans for the property, known as Goring Hill, call for the construction of an elegant five-star hotel. At the bottom of Goring Hill was the very impressive two-story ultra-modern greenhouse known as the Gartnerei. Built in 1938 to meet the special demands of Hitler's vegetarian diet, the greenhouse provided delicacies for both the Berghof and the Wolfschanze, the Fuehrers' Eastern Front headquarters in Prussia. Situated on a majestic hill overlooking the valley of Berchtesgaden was the imposing Alpine Chalet of the only other member of the Inner Circle living on the Obersalzberg, architect Albert Speer. In 1937, Speer had a special design studio built next door to the house for the sole purpose of laying out the future buildings of the Reich. It was here that Hitler and his favorite architect would spend countless numbers of hours fusing Nazi culture into monumental architecture. Speer's first official commission came in 1934 with the construction of the Zeppelinfeld grandstands in Nuremberg. The massive structure not only skillfully radiated the ideology of the regime, but laid the foundations for the grandiose buildings of the Thousand-Year Reich.